It's rare to see a protest movement escalate this quickly, and even rarer to see a government respond with this level of violence. Iran right now looks less like a country struggling with unrest and more like a society in outright crisis. There are credible reports suggesting more than 12,000 people have been killed in the protests, a figure that, if accurate, would make this the deadliest crackdown in Iran's contemporary history. Even in situations where numbers are hard to verify because the regime shut down the internet nationwide and restricted phone access, the scale of the violence is visible in the footage coming out when connectivity briefly reopens, in morgues overwhelmed with bodies, and in hospital reports of severe gunshot injuries. Think about that for a second. You can't independently confirm everything happening inside Iran because the state literally cut off the global internet to hide it. That's not a defensive tactic. That's the behavior of a government that knows what it's doing will come back to haunt it. And the regime's justification for all of this, calling protesters enemies of God and threatening them with death sentences without fair trials, has only made the crisis worse, both domestically and internationally. There are documented cases of protesters being sentenced to death under vague charges like mohareba, essentially branding dissent as heresy. No matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, the optics of that are terrible. When a government's answer to political expression is execution, you're not just looking at suppression, you're looking at a breakdown of legitimacy. And international reactions are already shifting in ways that tell you this is no longer a strictly internal Iranian affair. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz publicly predicted what few world leaders have dared to say aloud, that this regime may be in its final days and weeks if it can only stay in power through brute force. European nations have condemned the violence, summoned Iranian ambassadors, and are preparing additional sanctions. The UN has called for an end to the cycle of horrific violence. President Donald Trump has been unusually vocal as well. He's encouraged Iranians to keep protesting and pledged that help is on its way, while at the same time slapping 25% tariffs on any country doing business with Iran, a move calculated to hit Tehran where it hurts most, its economy. Ask yourself this: how often do you see a U.S. president openly cheer on a domestic protest movement in another country? That's not a common diplomatic stance, and it tells you that the U.S. believes this moment is historically significant. That doesn't mean military intervention is imminent. Trump's administration has said it's considering strong options, but the reality is more complicated. Other powers have already signaled discomfort with escalating U.S. involvement. And Tehran has warned that any overt attack would bring disastrous consequences for U.S. forces based in the region. Instead, what's more likely in the near term is a hybrid approach: economic pressure plus political support for opposition figures. The U.S. may ramp up sanctions, tighten trade restrictions, and continue to publicly back protest movements, but boots on the ground or missile strikes, that remains a risky gambit, not just for Washington, but for the entire Middle East. The situation is volatile, and it's not clear where it goes next. But with internet blackouts ending in pockets, thanks partly to tools like Starlink, the truth of what's happening on the streets is finally leaking out. Now, here's where this stops being only about Iran and starts becoming a much bigger geopolitical problem. Because Iran doesn't exist in isolation. It sits at the intersection of energy markets, regional power balances, and great power competition. And when a regime starts killing its own population at this scale, every external actor with interests in the country has to decide how far it's willing to go to protect those interests. China is the obvious place to look first. China is Iran's single most important economic lifeline. Roughly a quarter of Iran's oil exports end up in China, often through indirect channels designed to skirt sanctions. To give you some context, that oil trade alone is worth tens of billions of dollars a year. That's not symbolic. That's structural. It keeps Iran's economy breathing when Western pressure tightens. And that's why Beijing's silence matters. So far, China has had almost nothing to say about the killings. No condemnation, no calls for restraint, no concern for human rights, just quiet diplomatic language about internal affairs. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the same posture China took during crackdowns in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and during other moments when a government used force to suppress dissent. Ask yourself why. China doesn't see Iran primarily as a country with a population demanding rights. It sees Iran as an energy supplier, a strategic partner against U.S. influence, and a key node in its broader effort to weaken Western economic pressure tools. Iranian oil helps China diversify away from U.S.-aligned suppliers. Iranian trade helps Beijing test sanctions-resistant payment systems. Iranian instability threatens both. That creates a dilemma. If the Iranian regime collapses, China risks losing access to cheap oil and long-term contracts. If the regime survives by mass violence, China inherits a partner that is internationally isolated and increasingly radioactive. Neither outcome is ideal. This is why you're seeing China tread carefully, not intervening, but not distancing itself either. Now look at the United States. Washington is publicly backing protesters, tightening economic screws, and signaling that it's watching closely. But history matters here. The U.S. has seen this movie before. Think back to 2009. Think back to 2019. Iran protests flare up, the regime cracks down, international outrage spikes, and then things freeze. The regime survives, sanctions remain, and the population pays the price. What's different this time is the scale and the visibility. When doctors start leaking information, when morgues overflow, when funerals turn into protests, when the government bans funerals altogether. Those are not signs of control. Those are signs of fear. And fear inside a regime is dangerous because it increases the odds of miscalculation. The U.S. knows that overt military intervention would be catastrophic. Iran is not Libya. It's not Syria. It's a country of nearly 90 million people with regional proxies, missile capabilities, and the ability to disrupt global energy markets overnight. A direct strike wouldn't stabilize anything. It would light the region on fire. So instead, Washington is leaning into pressure that stays just below the threshold of war. Tariffs, secondary sanctions, diplomatic isolation, cyber capabilities, political messaging aimed directly at the Iranian population. That phrase Trump used, "help is on its way," is intentionally vague. It keeps protesters hopeful without committing the U.S. to a specific action. It also keeps Tehran guessing, which is the point. But here's the uncomfortable reality. External pressure alone doesn't topple regimes. Internal fractures do. And the most important signal coming out of Iran right now isn't what foreign leaders are saying. It's the fact that information is leaking at all, that people inside the system are talking, that orders are being documented, that chains of command are being exposed. Remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, it wasn't because of a single protest. It was because the system started cracking from the inside. Officials stopped believing. Enforcement weakened. Loyalty fractured. Iran may not be there yet, but it's closer than it's been in decades. And that's why this moment matters. Not just for Iran, but for the balance of power across the Middle East and beyond. So where does this actually end? There are three broad paths forward, and none of them are clean. The first is the one the Iranian regime is clearly betting on. Brute force works. The protests are crushed. Fear sets in. The executions go ahead. Information leaks slow down. The world moves on to the next crisis. This has happened before. Remember 2019. Remember how quickly headlines faded once the streets were cleared? If that happens again, Iran becomes a more hardened, more paranoid state, more dependent on China, more hostile to the West, less stable internally. That doesn't bring calm. It just postpones the next explosion. The second path is fragmentation. Not a clean revolution, not a sudden collapse, but a slow breakdown. Parts of the security forces hesitate. Mid-level officials defect quietly. Enforcement becomes uneven. Some cities stay tense while others fall silent. This is the most dangerous scenario because it creates space for chaos. Criminal networks expand. Militias compete. Regional actors get involved indirectly. You don't get democracy. You get uncertainty. We've seen this pattern before in places like Syria and Libya, where initial protests turned into something far darker once the state lost coherence. The third path is the narrowest and the hardest: internal transition. That would require elements of the regime deciding survival means change, not repression. It would mean negotiations, power sharing, and guarantees that don't involve mass punishment. Historically, regimes only choose this route when they believe the alternative is worse. Right now, Tehran doesn't seem to believe that yet. And this is where external pressure has limits. Sanctions can weaken a state. Tariffs can strain an economy. Political support can embolden protesters. But none of that replaces internal legitimacy. No foreign government can manufacture that. It either exists or it doesn't. What makes this moment different is how exposed the regime looks. When you have to shut down the internet to govern, when you ban funerals because they turn into protests, when doctors risk their lives to leak casualty figures, when insiders quietly pass along orders and documents. Those are signs of a system under strain. At the same time, global power dynamics complicate everything. China doesn't want chaos in Iran, but it also doesn't want a Western-aligned government there. Russia wants the US distracted, but not a regional war. Gulf states fear instability, but also fear Iran's current behavior. Everyone is hedging. No one is rushing in to solve this. And ordinary Iranians are stuck in the middle. That's the part that often gets lost. This isn't a chessboard, it's millions of people making daily decisions under extraordinary pressure. Do you go to a protest knowing you might not come home? Do you stay silent and live with the consequences? Do you flee if you can? These choices accumulate. They shape outcomes more than any press conference or policy statement. For the United States, this is also a test. Not of military strength, but of restraint and credibility. If Washington signals support and then disappears, it reinforces cynicism. If it escalates recklessly, it risks a regional disaster. If it does nothing, it confirms what many already believe, that moral language only goes so far when interests are at stake. For China, this is a stress test of its non-interference doctrine. Silence might protect oil contracts in the short term, but it also ties Beijing's reputation to a regime killing its own citizens. That cost may not show up immediately, but it accumulates. And for the rest of the world, this is a reminder of how fragile stability can be. Systems that look solid can crack fast. Governments that appear unshakable can suddenly look unsure. The protests in Iran may succeed. They may fail. History doesn't give guarantees. But one thing is already clear. The old assumption that this regime could manage dissent indefinitely without consequence is gone. The world is watching more closely. The internal pressure is heavier. And the choices being made now, by protesters, by leaders, by foreign powers, will echo long after the streets quiet down. This isn't just another news cycle. It's one of those moments people look back on and say, that's when things started to change.